webinar on podcasting. So if you've been looking to create your own podcast or get started in podcasting, make sure you stay tuned for the next half hour. Podcasting has exploded in popularity over the last couple of years, with the latest figures from Apple from this month, April 2021, saying there are 48 million individual podcast episodes on Apple Podcasts. But with most podcasts only getting a couple of hundred listens at most, how do you make yours stand out? Well, we are very happy to be joined by somebody whose latest podcast just yesterday topped the Apple iTunes charts in Ireland. He is the multi-award-winning podcaster and producer, head of RTE's famous Documentary on One team, 4 times winner of the Prix Europa, and the author of our podcasting and audio storytelling university awarded diploma course, Liam O'Brien. Liam, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
No worries. Hi, Susan. Hello, everyone.
So, guys, this is your opportunity over the next half hour to ask Liam any burning questions you have about podcasting. But to get started, Liam, maybe could you tell us what you think might be one of the key ingredients in creating podcasts that listeners actually want to listen to?
Yeah, so I guess the first thing to say is there's obviously a number of different types of podcasts. If you look at the charts in any given day, you have what we would call narrative-driven podcast series, limited series, 6, 8, 10 parts. You have personality-driven podcasts, and then you have a raft of other, that would be news or sport or things like that. So I guess, in general terms, what you need to ensure is that your podcast is a unique offering, whatever that is. So that could be your personality. It could be the angle of approach. For us, it tends to be different types of narrative series or different types of narrative stories, one-off documentaries. And then I guess the second, obviously then the how you tell it. So if we look at narrative series, 6, 8, 10 part series, really the kind of things you're looking for there are depth of story. So you're looking for a story that's big enough, that's wide enough, that's deep enough that you can explore through multi-episodic telling of it in that way. And that really is a lot easier than it sounds, because there are lots of brilliant stories out there, but actually to find one that has real depth and even things like multiple characters and multiple tellers and multiple locations, these are all, you need movement. It's the same as Netflix. If you watch a series on Netflix, are you going to sit down for 10 hours and watch 2 people on screen? You're unlikely to be able to engage with that beyond a few minutes. So you need a lot of different types of things happening in a narrative podcast series. And that's kind of the broad brushstrokes there of what makes a good one.
Yeah, so I've heard you in the past talk about stories like a series of scenes. What do you mean by that when you say that?
Well, I guess scenes they can be a number of things. So, for instance, our current podcast series, Gunplot, which just launched there Monday week ago. It's on episode 2 now. That's a 50-year-old story. So some of the scenes that you have, when we talk about scene, we talk about action. So something happening. In a perfect scenario, that's like you're with a camera and you're actually capturing an event unfolding in front of your eyes. The same thing in audio. So scenes are visual, of course, even though you hear them. They create pictures for you. So that's why scenes are so important. So in Gunplot, for instance, we have scenes which are from archive. So either film or audio that was used recorded 50 years ago, and we're now using the audio of them. Equally, you can paint pictures, you can paint scenes through your narrative. So I can tell you about a man walking through the door. It's a blue door. The handle is broken. The glass in the front pane is also broken, and there's blood dripping on it. straight away you have a scene, you have an image in your head. And that creates a couple of things. It creates connection, because if you can visually move through a story, it makes your understanding of the story, more than likely, it makes it clearer. And also it kind of gives a deeper connection. So much of audio especially, is information led. And so information can sometimes kind of skim over the surface, and scene allows you to go a bit deeper. So that's really what we talk about in scenes. It's kind of like, if you imagine it in television terms, it's like a newsreader reading the news, and then the images of what they're describing come on the screen. And it changes. It changes how you engage with that information. And it authenticates it as well.
So if somebody is looking to get started in podcasting, Liam, what advice would you give them?
Start small would be the first thing. So I would start with a one-part story. If you're starting from scratch, start with a one-part story. Because the essence of any podcast series, again, we're talking about narrative podcast series, or limited edition, is that they are a story. And the longer your story, the more complicated it gets. So to get to grips with the basics, which we've done over many years, is start with small, in inverted commas, small stories, short time frames. So I would encourage anyone starting out, make a 10-minute audio piece. And then if you can find your groove, and like the simple things of recording, editing, narrating, interviewing people, once you can kind of find your groove in that, it'll take time. It's not an overnight thing. Then maybe you might move to a two-parter, 2 10-minute parts. And they might be, we've all seen various television series in the past where you have one episode, and it's the same story told from 2 different perspectives. Like the husband tells it and then the wife tells it. So it's the same story, we just hear it in 2 different ways, in 2 different parts. So the point is, add something in that takes your story beyond a standalone 10-minuter and makes it into a 20-minuter, and maybe look at different perspectives, or part A and part B, or part 1 and part 2, and then slowly start to build out. That's how I would approach it if I was starting from scratch now. It's all about small building blocks. The essence of great podcast series is that essentially they take these huge stories, sometimes really complicated ones, and they simplify them down into beats and into scenes and into stages and chapters of story. And that allows you to get your way through it as a listener. All of that takes time. So
that's really good advice. And for anybody watching who's currently doing our podcasting graded courses with RSL, I think that's really good, because as you go up the grades, you're doing more of a series. So taking Liam's advice there and how you look at building that as you go through the grades, that's just really, really good advice. And also for anybody at home who just wants to create their own podcasts, and before thinking about it as a series, really, I think that's just fantastic advice. So when you were doing these, so one of the things with anybody who's not familiar maybe with the RT.com1 team's podcasts and stories is that you do really, I guess, real stories about real people. I think sometimes people think they need to have something extraordinary, like an extraordinary event to talk about or do. What advice would you give there, Liam? Because I think you've really shown over the years that it can be the simplest stories told really, really well that really connects with people.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a kind of an overused phrase, but the extraordinary within the ordinary. There are so many elements of our lives that we just pass through every day. And those elements can sometimes be people and places and events. And for instance, this morning, I not to go down not divert off the route too much, but I keep a hobby farm. We recently had triplet lambs. One of the lambs needs to be bottle fed because there's enough milk in the mum. I took my 6-year-old daughter in to feed the lamb. That moment of going into the field to feed the lamb, the feeding of the lamb, what happens during the feeding, the after, that is a story. And that simplicity, that ordinariness, like if you start to dissect that and take it apart, the beauty of that, the innocence of it, there are so many layers to that if that's how you look at it. If you just think child feeds lamb in field, that's exactly what you get. But my point is, the stories are all about how you look at them, and the most simplest of stories can have the most complex of meanings, and you could tell a whole story about life, about birth, about survival through the feeding of a baby lamb. So it's all about how you look at them, and I guess it's going back to that thing that there are people starting out, especially, but also people who've been making content for many years. There's a sense that you're constantly looking or striving for the perfect story. And I suppose in a way there is no perfect story, but equally there are lots of stories which are amazingly good. They're right under your nose, more than likely, and they're ones I would often go for, because things that are close to you will be easier for you to tell. You'll have easier access. You'll probably enjoy it more because it has more meaning to your own life, things like that. So yeah, it's about those things of look small, look close, and look at the normal things that aren't actually, that there's extraordinary elements within any normal situation.
So we have a couple of questions coming in. So on YouTube, Max has asked, he said, something I noticed about the Nobody Zone, there was such an incredible balance between when the narrator told us the story and when the subjects told us the story. How did you find that balance? Great question. Thank you, Max.
Yeah, it took a bit of time, Max, is the first thing. And, the Nobody Zone was a complicated story because we ourselves weren't always sure, or it wasn't always clear what was true and what was not true. And sometimes things needed to be said twice, and they needed to be said the same thing needed to be said in different ways. And if I tell you something, so I tell you I met this man and he had a really difficult childhood, and it affected him all his life. I can tell you that. Now the man comes in and he tells you that. Now that changes how you hear it. So, like in storytelling, sometimes that balance that you were talking about, Max, when you're told something in the story or information that will follow, and then you get to hear that information from a real life character who lived that story, who was in it, it changes, and there is an anticipation comes with, you load tension onto something. When I tell you I'm going to tell you this before you're told it, you're loading tension on. And of course you have you have that balancing act, which is so important in narrative series, where your narrator, your reporter, whoever it is that's kind of leading you through the story, they must catch you by the hand as a listener, and they must guide you through that story. That's not to say you need to like them, you don't like them, but you must be able to understand really clearly what's happening at all times. And if you don't, of course, what happens is you get lost, and when you get lost, you get pushed away, and that's when you lose listeners. So there was a lot of hand-holding through the Nobody Zone, because there was a lot of disparate characters and a lot of different things, and there was lots of different versions of the truth and untruth, and so it was always trying to strike that balance. And I guess ultimately that's a subjective view, but the way we worked in the documentary in one team, and in terms of Nobody Zone, Rob Mulhern was with us, and Tim and Krista from Third Ear, is we had between us we had 10 pairs of kind of experienced ears, and so we were feeding back. And I often think of either a documentary or an episode of a series, I think of it like a sculpture, like a piece of wood, and you're constantly, shaping it and grooving it and maybe putting a little bit out. You have to kind of have that tactile approach to story to really get the best out of it. Yeah, to play with it.
Brilliant. Thank you for that question, Max. And just speaking briefly of the Nobody Zone, I think there is some news as they're hot off the press with the Nobody Zone. Are we allowed to talk about it?
Yeah, no, The Nobody Zone just there last week or the week before has been signed by Creative Artists Agency in Hollywood. They're the biggest talent agency in Hollywood and in the world, or one of anyway. So yeah, it looks like it's en route to the big screen, or big film production, big film, TV land, whatever. Netflix,
it's fantastic news.
Great, yeah.
And
but of course, it comes back to that quality of story, and that's an amazing aspect to podcasts. That what in the Nobody Zone started out as a thought in my head and went on to this and that, and we're able to make it, and then it looks now as if it could be potentially become, bigger than any of us could have ever imagined. And that is the power of podcasts in a way, it's that connection. And that, of course, it's a global audience because your podcast can be heard from anywhere. And in the case of the Nobody Zone, it's somewhere heading towards 4 million listens. So, that's a lot of people in a lot of different places. And, ultimately it's a testament to story and to the medium.
It's incredible. You see the power of podcasting. Oh my goodness, for anybody who's still wondering whether they should start. So I think if that says anything, it just shows you the potential there. So John from Twitter has asked Liam, could you advise on some software to start off podcasting with?
Yeah, so there are a number of different types. I know that one of the ones that we're using and in conjunction with GoCreate is the Steinberg Wavecast. So, very simple, very straightforward. Gives you lots of options, keenly priced. So that would be, certainly for a beginner, that would be one of the ones we point you towards, yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you, Liam. So Dave Ward has asked, can you say something about the importance of diction, clarity and intelligibility on your podcasts?
Yeah, it's Dave, it's an unusual one in that obviously you want your what you're saying to be comprehensionable. So you want people to be actually able to understand it. But there is a kind of a layer in which if diction and deliverability steps over a line, it moves into, I would say, a sense of delivery. And that is an enemy, I would think, of narrative storytelling, because then you feel the story is kind of being delivered to you by somebody akin to a newsreader, as distinct from somebody who is inside the story. The teller is inside the story. So personally, you have a minimum requirement in terms of that, literally comprehensionability, that people can understand you. But in terms of differences of accent, even if people have slight speech impediments or they have impaired delivery, like if you're from Dublin, maybe you don't pronounce your THs, or if you're from the UK, you mightn't pronounce your H's, or whatever it is. That, to me, they are signs of real life people, of authentic people, and they are so important to story, and particularly they're so important to podcast. And of course, what they allow you to do is they allow you to stand out from the crowd, because they give that podcast an identity. Whereas if everybody's talking in the same way, you can see how it becomes this kind of bland almost, consistency across everything. So you're trying to tread those two lines of, being able to understand people quite clearly. You need that, of course, but also then not losing this kind of authenticity. And you are who you are at the end of the day, and your characters are who they are. And that is essentially why you went to them, because of the quality of their story. So, yeah, it's a balancing act always, of course.
Brilliant. Thank you, Liam. So Anne Fitzgerald, lovely to see you, Anne. Great to see you joining in. She has said congrats, as has Kelly Crichton. Wayne Crichton, sorry, I think I'm reading your name out wrong there, Kelly. Wayne Wright has said, do you wait until you have all the interviews and transcripts completed before you start to write your first draft of the script? Or do you start writing ideas and notes as you go through the research and interviewing stages?
So when it depends what you're approaching. In general, so what I mean by that is it a one-part, one-off documentary, or is it multi-episodic? With a one-off documentary, in general, you need to have a rough outline. So what I mean by that is you need to know roughly where the story starts, and that can often be just a chronology. So that gives you a chronology, obviously gives you a natural timeline through a story. You have to have a kind of a rough idea of a start, of an end, and a middle. Not without being overly prescriptive, but you must have an idea. So why you need that is because when you're going out for you to do your interviews with your interviewees, you need to have a sense of direction of where your story is going, of what it is about, of where it might begin and where it might end. And if you don't have that, what will generally tend to happen is you will swim around in interviews looking for pieces of information. You're not quite sure what you're looking for, so you'll end up gathering lots of information. You'll come back, you'll do that maybe 4, 5, 10 times, 10 different people, and you're hit with a wall of information and you're like, oh my God, where do I start? And that's actually has happened to me and a lot of I'm sure everyone in the Doc and One team. So to get I would encourage people to give themselves an idea of a rough shape on their project from the outset. So if I'm telling the story of a football match, for instance, I should probably decide what perspective am I telling it from. Am I going to try and encapsulate everything between when the match started and when it ends, or I'm going to start the day before or the day after? You can hear already, like if I start the day before and the day after, well then I've extra people I need to interview. So you need to have some idea. In podcast series, it changes because you have a lot more content to record, your story is going to be a lot longer, and you will get lost for those two reasons alone. So you must have a storyboard for podcast series. So like for the Nobody Zone, we storyboarded it initially over a 3 or 4 day period. We would have had some research. We actually had a one-off documentary made in the story at that stage, so we knew a lot of the story. But even with Gunplot, the one that we're currently in the middle of, we would have storyboarded that initially. Then we would have revised the storyboard. Then we would have done some recordings and seen that actually maybe what we thought was there shouldn't be there. You're constantly revising your storyboard, but you can only revise it if you have one to begin with. So, again, a natural line of chronology is a great place to start in developing a storyboard. So episode 1 is from the first 2 months. Episode 2 is, when you see it on paper and you see the 6 parts, you'll then see things like, whoa, I've way too much in part 5. I don't have enough in part 2. The guy that's my main character, he pops up in episode 6 and we didn't hear from him since episode 1. Or, things will start to emerge where you have to have that balance that somebody mentioned earlier between characters and narrators and story, so you need a storyboard. So the scripting of your narration largely comes towards the end and ideally should be bouncing or driven off if you interview somebody, you slot them into your storyboard. This is very roughly now I'm talking about. And you're cutting back and you have the best bits of their interview left in your edit. Well, then you're scripting around that. That's how we generally kind of approach it at a first pass. But of course, you have your overall structure to that episode or to the documentary. So your narration needs to set up the story and how it closes out. And I hope I'm not being overly prescriptive, because the thing with a storyboard that is a kind of a dilemma is that when you work to a storyboard, what can tend to happen is you put blinkers up. So when you're out doing your recordings, as I said earlier, and you know what you're going for, but when you know what you're going for, there's a risk that you might miss something. because then you're ignoring things which you feel you shouldn't be recording because you're going for this. So, it takes a bit of experience essentially and making mistakes to find that kind of balance between a freedom of allowing a story to develop on the hoof and an openness towards things happening as you're recording, but also a kind of a structure so you don't get completely lost, because the podcast series they're gargantuan pieces of work. On average it's 2 years plus 2.5 years into a 6-part series. Could be spread, of course, that 2.5 year period could be spread amongst 2 or 3 people, but that's the time commitment. I mean, you're making a film essentially. Like Gunplot is 8 parts, 35 minutes probably on average. That is, what's that, 240 minutes? No. Whatever it is, it's a long time. It's 300, That's a huge amount of story.
Yeah.
So if you don't have a plan starting out, there's no way you'll make it through. And you might have a brilliant first episode, but when you get to episode 2 or 3, everything starts to crumble around you because you're chasing tails,
Yeah. Thank you, Liam. I hope, Wayne, that's answered your question. If you have any follow-up one there, just let us know. I'm just going to jump to Michelle and Kelly's question because it's related here. She has said, Liam, how important is collaboration in creating a great story for podcast? And can you speak to collaboration in the context of an individual starting out on their own in this vista, please? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, in terms of all our work is defined by collaboration, in that we work together as a team. If somebody pitches into us, we work together with them. And there is always at least 2 people working in a production, and something like Gunplot, there is, multiples of people. And what collaboration does is, after, you need basic things like a general understanding. You need to be kind of on the same playing surface, or same world essentially in terms of story, and then you will always get friction, and that's what happens in creativity. The white light of creativity, you're going to get very different views and very passionate views, and they are really important, and when you have people fighting for different elements of the story, then you're more than likely going to get a good outcome once you can work those things through. But collaboration is so important once you're both moving in the same direction. The definition of collaborate is to come together. Where collaboration fails is if on paper it's collaboration, where you have 2 people or 2 entities come together, but actually they're not collaborating, they're not working together, they're working 2 different directions because they have 2 different ideas of the story. That is super dangerous and likely highly destructive. So it's about it. Everything kind of comes back to that. Like when we were collaborating with Third Ear, for instance, and Nobody's Own, we spent 3 or 4 days, from memory, maybe 5, locked up in a hotel in the Midlands. This is way before COVID times.
Different world.
And literally, we were in a room from 9 to 6 every day, and we were fighting our way through a storyboard. And when we came out the other side, we had a rough structure of all our elements, and we were trying to have a balance of things through it, and intrigue and tension and conflict, and you have that in an overall arc across your what turned out to be 8 episodes in the end, but was 6 at that point. But you also have it within each episode, so there's lots of stuff to work through. And if collaboration works, it is the most brilliant way to work, because you will bounce off each other. People are likely to draw more out of you, and you will draw more out of them than they can do on their own. And that is why collaboration, it's our DNA, really.
Indeed. Well, thank you for the question, Michelle, and thank you, Liam, for answering. Just a couple of quick questions, and then we're going to bring in our other special guest, Joanna. So just, John, from Kelly, she's asked, is there any support for new podcasters out there? Example, podcast community groups, and is there anyone commissioning podcasts at the moment, to your knowledge?
Um, there are people commissioning podcasts. RTE is currently in the midst of moving towards the setup of a podcast unit. We hope it might be later this year. It might take a little longer. So I think that would be very exciting in the Irish podcast scene when it comes off, hopefully. But I think, I think a lot of more and more places are becoming open to podcast. And like, I remember reading an article with a lady, or doing a seminar with a lady in Australian broadcasting, and she was arguing vehemently that podcast is not a genre, podcast is a platform. And, on the one hand, I agree with her. And why I say it here in terms of the commissioning is that, TikTok is a storytelling platform. Facebook is, Twitter is, newspapers are, television is, Netflix is, blah, 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 So podcast is just another way of telling stories, if you were to look at it that way. And so, I think there are a huge amount of outlets out there that have yet to try and engage with podcasting. A lot of it is a kind of a sense of, I don't know how to do this, or I don't know what podcasts are even. That's still going on an awful lot. So it's a coming of age thing. But there's no podcast house bar. I think there is one independent podcast company in Dublin, whose name escapes me now, but they do commission. But yeah, it's as of yet, there are the pathways into podcast creation in kind of a structured way in which, where you're working for somebody. They're unclear. But the flip side of that is that you can create a podcast yourself if you can get it up and running, if you can get an audience. Then you have the possibility of monetizing it. Then you have the possibility of independence, as in like financial independence. And Ireland is hugely behind where certainly the US is in terms of monetization. But even this year, it's estimated in the region of 8 million euros will be spent by advertisers in Ireland on podcasting and streaming. So, it's a lot of money, and there isn't a huge amount of Irish podcast content yet. You look through the top 50, say, in iTunes Ireland, I'd say you'd be lucky if 15% of it is Irish content, maybe 20. And 12, 18 months ago, you were lucky if 5% of it was Irish. Things are starting to move now. RT is a generation behind in terms of podcast, but Ireland is a generation behind in terms of creating, in terms of podcast creation, but in terms of podcast engagement. Irish people are way up there. They're the most engaged podcast listeners in Europe per head of capita. So there's all these different things going on,
Yeah, it's really interesting question, and I feel like this is a good moment also to mention why we've created this podcasting course with Liam for people who do want to learn how to make great podcasts and audio documentaries, and that is again launching next week. So it's a couple of days, I think 4 days left to enroll in that for anybody who is interested in enrolling. Or if they have any questions, now is a good time to also ask those questions. So we've had a few other, and then actually, sorry, just to reinforce as well, Liam, something that you said there earlier, like with Wave Labs Cast, I mean, that is just opening everything up. It's so easy to use if you don't have a tech background. So there's all these, new things coming out that I think are really helping people get started podcasting, and then once you get started, it's really going on that journey and actually doing it, so you can improve again after each time you do it. So a couple of other questions we have. I just actually need to plug in my laptop. The battery's going a bit low there, so I'll have to do that. But we have a question from Grumpy Old Man. That's his name. He says that Liam, can you recommend a storyboard app, or is there any such thing?
There is. Let me just make sure I have the right one. I think it's called Grapple or Scapple. That's what it's called. And yeah, you can. Sorry, I was just looking it up there on my
Yeah,
email.
perfect.
It's called Scapple, and it's so it allows you just to write in a paragraph, put a frame around it, and you can drag it anywhere on the page. And so we use that quite a lot. There's a freeware version of it.
How do you spell that, Liam? Sorry, just
it's Scapple. Scapple.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you.
Scapple, yeah, and it's by far the best one I've used. Yeah.
And then just the last question Grumpy Old Man has also asked is just around, I think he's asking about, do you have any preferable headsets that you use when recording podcasts?
In terms of headphones?
I'm not sure whether that's what you mean there, Grumpy Old Man. But yeah, maybe just if we say it's on headphones.
Yeah, so in terms of headphones, like we use Sennheiser headphones. They're not that expensive. They'd be under €100. But the key thing about any headphone that you use is make sure it's what's called closed cup.
Yep.
So I have one here in front of me, so you can see there. And when I put it over my ears are fully covered. See? So you can't see any part of my ear. And that is super important for recording because that is what your listener will hear. That is the world they will inhabit in your podcast. So if you're not aware of what's happening when you're recording someone, and that there's a Kango hammer going in the background, for instance, whereas if you turned around, that Kango hammer is way less, noticeable in volume. You got to have your headphones on. I keep saying always that people don't go out and shoot, can't film, with their eyes closed. But It's the same premise when you're recording. Good set of headphones, decent microphone, and it goes so far.
Brilliant. Okay, thank you. And I think that was it. I think he was talking specifically around Zoom interviews. So I think that applies there, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, what you're kind of talking about, I guess, with the headset there, it's more actually the audio quality in terms of the Zoom. There's actually a setting in Zoom where you can increase the audio quality, and it depends on the sound card. There are also some other softwares, like for instance, there's one called Zencastr, Zencastr, and what that allows you to do is, if you're interviewing somebody, we've used it a lot during these COVID times. You're interviewing somebody in Brazil. What happens is you send them a link, they open up the link at their end, and you're in charge of the recording in your home in Dublin or Galway or London or wherever it is. And when you press record, Zencastr records them locally in Brazil, and when the interview is finished, it sorts the recording there, and it sends you the recording remotely, and then it lands in your desktop. So what you're doing there is you're removing any bandwidth issues which you will have in Zoom, where there might be a little flicker or anything like that. So any piece of software that allows you to record locally at both sides and then gives you the recordings afterwards, that's way more preferable.
Okay.
My quality on computers is so hit and miss. It's hard to control, for third parties.
Thank you, Liam. Just a quick question before we bring Joanna in. Gary McCafferty has asked, "Hi Liam, I'm just wondering if you expect students to already have the foundation of a story they want to develop before starting the course?"
No, and in some ways it's nearly better not to, because part of the course is to, I guess, allow you to, I can remember the day that it dropped for me. That's what story is. And it was through it was actually the head of Norwegian Broadcasting at the time who was doing some masterclasses. Berit Hederman was her name. And it was like the world turned from black and white to colour. I can't explain it, but story is about, it's about how you look at the world in a way, and we are all natural storytellers because that's how we communicate with each other. That's how human beings communicate. But, how to tell other people's stories especially, and how to construct them and put them in a way which serves that story best and maxes it out, in terms of its qualities. That takes a bit of time. So, I think I can't remember
Gary.
Gary, yeah. So in terms of Gary's question, like in a way, Gary, you're nearly better off coming with no ideas per se, because I would hope that as the course, progresses, you would say, no, and now you look at things differently, and now you would hopefully see stories everywhere, because they are everywhere. That's the reality.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Liam. Right, I'm going to bring in Joanna McNicholas, who's going to join us. Joanna is one of our Go Create alumni who went through the course, and she had she's a very successful journalist with an incredible story that around one of her documentaries. So I'm just going to see if I can bring her in here. If any of you... Hi, Joanna. I'm not sure if you can hear me yet, Joanna. Can you hear me, Joanna?
Hi, can you hear me, Susan? I have no camera. Not sure what's happening here.
I'm just seeing if you're here on the screen with us. Brilliant. Well, Joanna, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Oh, yes.
And I know we're running a few minutes behind schedule, but I tell you, Joanna, I would love if you could share the story of Benji the Gable with our viewers this evening.
Oh my goodness. Yes, Benji the Gable. Well, that was a bit of a story, wasn't it?
Sorry. Can you hear us there? We've had. So Joanna, how did that story get made? How did it start out?
It was just a friend, really, who's a farmer and who had a bull, and I happened to visit him regularly, and I heard about the bull, and that's how it happened.
So for anybody who has never listened to the documentary, if you just could sum it up in a couple of sentences, what the documentary was about and who is the eponymous Benji?
Yes, well, Benji was a slight bit different to your normal bull because he had no interest in the ladies. So in actual fact, he was a gay bull. So it was a very good story that ended up being made into a documentary because the story went around the world.
And so how did it go viral? Was it
It went viral. It went into a local newspaper first and foremost, and then we sent it off to the Daily Mail, and countrywide, the programme on RT Radio on Saturday morning, they picked it up because Graham Norton happened to be down the corridor, and he also delivered it to his BBC listeners, and then it took off, and it went to Australia and New Zealand and Africa, and my brother's friend in New York heard it on a radio station there, and it went all over. There was really nowhere else it could go to unless it went out to space.
Well, I mean, I'll link under this to anybody who hasn't heard the documentary so they can have a listen to it later. But what's the latest on Benji now? How's he doing these days?
Well, I haven't heard anything from him recently, but when we made the DocCon one with Nicoline Greer, Joe Kelly, that's the farmer, and we visited him in Norfolk, and he was doing very well at that time. But I haven't heard anything lately, so I'm not sure exactly how he is.
And did I hear that you were recently featured on the One Show about this as well?
Oh, yes. BBC came chasing us up. They wanted to get to the root of this and see where this animal had come from and meet the farmer and suss out the birthplace, really, of this most unusual animal.
Well, I know when I was listening to the documentary, the thought of the fact that the farmer was going to be anonymous, that nobody knew exactly who he was, where he was. I mean, how did you keep that a secret?
Oh, that was the best kept secret ever. Yes, I didn't tell anyone. It was a bit like the nobody zone. Nobody knew this. Yes, we just had to keep it very, very quiet from everyone.
Oh, it's fantastic. So, Joanna, can I just ask you, for a couple of the guys watching our on one of our, our audio storytelling course that you went through, was there stuff on that that really helped you when you were making your doc, or any of your docs, recently?
Yes, I found that course very good, because just around that time I was also making the doc on one, so it all came together, and I made a little mini doc on that course of yours, which ended up going out on Seascapes and RTE Radio, and as a result of that, now it's in regular work into Seascapes. I do freelance work with them because I live on the coast here in Mayo, so there's always something happening locally of a maritime nature.
That's fantastic. And and so is there anything that you're working on at the moment that you'd like to share with us?
Well, I'm making a documentary about a plane crash here in Achill, but that happened in 1950 when 8 RAF men were killed. But the most thing I'm working on at the moment is actually a book that I'm finishing, so I'm squeezing out the radio work just for these couple of weeks until I finish the book and get that out.
That is fantastic. Oh my goodness. Well, I'm definitely going to link below for anybody who hasn't seen that documentary or any of your others. Thank you so much, Joanna, for joining us and letting us know about those. I don't know, Liam, was there anything that you had to ask Joanna there about the doc, or any updates or anything there?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think one of the great qualities of the doc was obviously Benji, but also Joanna, that like we can even hear from your character there, like it's kind of slightly mischievous, and and like it's kind of something that somebody else mentioned about diction, and like it's like Joanna is exactly as we hear her in Benji's story. This is who we meet now here on the screen today, and that is so important. Like that, you remain authentic. You are who you are, and it's actually all the more engaging for that. Joanna, I'm sure you heard the story about people on their way down to Electric Picnic, in the bus loads, all listening to Benji when it was actually going up on the radio. Like, they're amazing stories of engagement, and group engagement then in that instance. And so there's lots of different qualities. Like, obviously, it was a unique selling point. Like, I'm sure there's hundreds of wolves who are gay, you know what I mean? But here we had one guy, and the other thing that Joanne and Nicoline did together with the farmer is Benji became a character in the same way that the farmer was a character and Joanne was a character. You had all these different characters, and so that, in terms of story, that moves so far beyond information, because it's something that's real now, and you can empathize. You could empathize with Benji the Gable. You felt sorry for him. You were rooting for him. That's what stories can do, as distinct from, there's tens of thousands of cattle killed every day in Ireland, and no one bats an eyelid. And here we had one guy, and we're all rooting for him. But that's the quality of storytelling. Ultimately, that's what changes things, because your perspective changes on something that, and this is an instance that the extraordinary within the ordinary, like what else would you call a bull in the field only the ordinary kind of thing, and yet you had this amazing extraordinary story that didn't just move, in terms of, it did very well in various European-wide competitions and picked up a couple of awards, and like went on to the BBC television, and I'm sure you're probably sick of it now, Joanne.
He always keeps appearing up though. Just when we think he's gone, he'll make another appearance. Somebody just now, you contacted me about this the other day.
Yeah, it's incredible.
Power story.
Yes, I think everybody can see that, podcasting, what it can, just the opportunities as well around when you're creating these podcasts and stories, where things, I'm sure, Joanna, you probably didn't imagine at that first, when you started that you'd end up on the one show talking about it.
Oh, no. It was totally comedy from beginning to end. It really was, the story started the papers, the media chase. Then when we had the .com one and we went over, it was just a barrel of laughs really all the way.
So Joanna, I've got a couple of questions coming in for you on that. Max has asked, what were the steps that happened between you doing the course and your idea getting commissioned? So I don't know, do you remember the timeline there in terms of how and when that was happening?
Well, they happened around the same time because I did the .com one seminar in 2018, spring 2018 in Dublin, in the RT centre there, and that's where I met yourselves. Although I had been thinking of doing the course, I signed up for it there and then. But a few months after, it was actually a lady I met at that course, at the seminar, who was sitting beside me, and we were chatting, and it was she who suggested that Benji would make a very good story. But I didn't do anything about it until about 6 months later, kind of towards the autumn. I sent in a word, then I pitched the idea, and just before Christmas they sent me back an email to say that they were going to take it on. So it was all happening. Everything was going on concurrently, really. I was doing the course, and the .com one was all happening simultaneously, really. There wasn't a link, really, I'd say, between the two.
And did it help you, Joanna, doing the course at the same time as you were putting together your documentary?
It did, definitely. Yes, it gave me an understanding of how things were moving and the process that was happening and getting the story together. And yeah.
Brilliant. We have another question here from Grumpy Old Man. He said, "Hi Joanna, well done on your on this podcast. Can I ask how you decide when a story is ready?"
How do you mean ready now? I'm just wondering, do you mean
probably,
like when you have the audio work finished or the story gathered?
I think he might mean finished, maybe when you stop editing, maybe, or...
Yeah, generally I find there's just a feeling inside, and you just know you've given this all you have, and that's what I would go by.
Yeah,
it's like it's like the inner radar just knows, because you can overwork something too. It's the same with writing. You can overwork and you can murder it.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, Liam, do you have any kind of formula yourself for when you know when something is ready? Time to put the tools down.
I'd be kind of in Joanne's camp in terms of that you have a kind of a natural feeling. Equally, that you can have a natural feeling that you're missing something, or it doesn't feel like the circle is rounded, and so you might be looking for a closing scene or a final interviewee or something like that. But I mean, on paper, it kind of comes back to that storyboard or that overall view of a story, like where's the start, middle, and end, and if you got that, you've got a long way there, And in our, in reality, this is our job. So we must make one, finish it, move on to the next one, make that one, finish it, move on to the next one. So there's a reality there that, you got to fill a schedule, and so things must finish up at some point.
Yeah, just finally, I think Grumpy Old Man, he said he means ready to get started when you decide I'm going to do this. So maybe it's that it's an idea that's worth creating is what maybe that he's asking there. I don't know, Liam, do you have a specific...
Oh yeah, I mean, like the vast majority of people, the reason they will never make a documentary or never make a podcast is not the story, it's them. It's always the way, it's just taking that step of that, like, when Joanne pitched into us, it's not a huge step, but for some people it can feel a huge step, but it's just push yourself in, push your idea into the world and see what happens. And try things. It's so important to try, and even with us, like, if people pitch into us and the idea isn't successful for whatever reason, there's 7 of us in the team and we all commission collectively. We love seeing somebody who's had an idea rejected coming back to us, because that tells you something about somebody. It tells you that they understand that stories aren't, every story is precious, but that maybe not every story, is for a national audience or whatever. So it's about trying, and more often than not, anyone who pitches in to us more than once, they will always end up making content with us, you know.
Fantastic. Well, thank you, Liam, and thank you, Joanna. So I think we're going to wrap things up now. Thank you, everybody who's joined in and for all your questions. And yeah, there's just a couple of days left before our next round of the diploma course starts. So if any of you are interested in joining that, please do get in touch with hello@gocreateacademy.com. And I hope you've all taken a lot away this evening from podcasting. Clearly, the sky is the limit. Listening to Liam talking about, you know, where some of their podcasts have gone, what's happened, and Joanna as well. Definitely have a listen to Benji the Gable. We'll put a link to it below for any of you who haven't listened. It's just a brilliant story and so well told. As Liam said, going back to that thing on the addiction and thing, you know, you can hear Joanna's character here now in front of us, and when you listen to the doc, you'll see it's exactly the same, and just absolutely brilliant. So thank you so much. Thank you, Joanna. Thank you, Liam, and thank you guys for watching. We'll see you all soon.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.